Millionaire sees his ex-wife selling cakes on the street with twin girls who look exactly like him. The autumn morning draped New York in a thin silver mist. The air buzzed with car horns, hurried footsteps, and the scent of freshly roasted coffee. Ethan Walker sat behind the wheel of his black Audi, eyes fixed on the stream of emails lighting up his phone screen. Then the traffic light turned red. He looked up and froze. Across the busy Brooklyn corner, amid the rush of strangers, a woman stood behind a small cart selling homemade churros. A faded floral apron hung around her waist, her brown hair tied neatly back, her smile soft as she handed a bag to a customer. For a brief, breathless second, Ethan forgot how to breathe. It was Clara Reyes, the woman he once loved, once hurt, and thought he would never see again. But it wasn't her presence that shattered him. It was the sight of two little girls helping her. Two identical faces with sunlit brown eyes and soft golden curls. One of them turned, and Ethan saw it clearly, his own reflection in those eyes. His heart constricted. There was no mistake. "Stop the car across the street! Hurry up!" he ordered, his voice trembling. The driver quickly obeyed. He stepped out of the car without thinking, moving as if pulled by something deep inside. His footsteps echoed over the pavement. Clara looked up, her eyes widened, then hardened instantly into the cold stare he remembered too well. "Ethan?" Her voice trembled, a mix of surprise and guarded fear. He swallowed hard, his voice rough. I can't believe you're here." For a moment, time stopped. 6 years vanished, collapsing into the space between them. The last argument, the slammed door, the silence that followed. The two little girls stood close, watching the stranger. One tugged at Clara's sleeve. "Mom, who is he?" Clara bent down, whispering softly, "It's okay, sweetheart. Just someone I used to know." Ethan looked down at the two little girls. His heart ached. He tried to smile, but his voice trembled. "What's your name, sweethearts?" Clara immediately replied, cold and firm. "That's not necessary, Ethan." The air between them was stretched thin, like a fragile thread about to snap. The wind swept through, carrying with it the scent of baked flour and bitter memories. Ethan didn't know what to say. He just stood there in silence. A customer stopped by. The clinking of coins echoed amid the scent of oil and caramelized sugar. Clara gently adjusted her apron and went on with her work, as if Ethan had never appeared on that street. He stood a few steps away, lost, his expensive suit completely out of place among the heat and the cinnamon smoke. The woman before him, the one who had once shared with him quiet mornings in a vast kitchen, was now just a slender back, steadfast in the flow of ordinary life. Little Lila and Lucy ran around the small pastry cart, laughing, unaware that the man watching them was falling apart inside. Ethan spoke softly, his voice almost melting into the sound of sizzling oil. "I'll come again, Clara." "For what?" She didn't look up. "To find the truth?" Clara said nothing. She simply flipped the next batch of pastries, her hands trembling slightly, the golden sheen of sugar glazing her eyes like a thin veil. Ethan turned away, each step heavy, as if carrying 6 years' worth of mistakes he had yet to atone for. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. The image of Clara and the two little girls kept appearing in his mind, so vividly that he could almost hear their laughter carried by the wind. He sat in his luxurious apartment, surrounded by glass, steel, and the shimmering reflections of city lights. Everything looked perfect, yet it all felt unbearably cold. He had once believed he had everything: a prestigious architecture firm, hundreds of employees, and projects of international scale. He had been hailed as a symbol of success in New York's design world. But on that silent night, every light around him seemed meaningless. Then came the memories. 6 years earlier. Back then, Ethan was 32, standing at the peak of his career. He had just signed a contract to design a skyscraper in Dubai, one of the biggest projects his firm had ever taken on. Work consumed every part of him, while Clara became just the remaining part of a schedule he rarely touched. "Can you come home early? I need you to go with me to the appointment," Clara had said that day, her voice weak over the phone. He was in the office, in the middle of a meeting with investors. Without even looking up, he replied, "Clara, today's impossible. Can you reschedule it for tomorrow?" "Ethan, I can't postpone it anymore. I promise next time I'll go. I'm doing this for our future." That sentence now echoed in his mind like a knife. For our future. But in truth, he had gone on alone and left her behind. That night, Clara waited for him until midnight. When he finally came home, she had already packed her suitcase. The argument that followed was fierce. He blamed her for not understanding his work pressure, while she told him he had lost his heart. Her last words, before stepping out the door, were, "You say you build towers so people have a place to return to, but you've never built a home for yourself." Ethan remembered that moment vividly, the sound of the door closing, the quiet that followed. He had thought she was just angry, that she'd come back in a few days. But she never did. Time passed. He became busier, more successful, more famous, and she completely disappeared. When he asked his secretary Fern, she merely replied indifferently. "She called a few times, but only to ask for money. I told her you were busy." He believed that. Because he believed it, he didn't look for her. Now, thinking back, Ethan realized how blind he had been. He leaned his head against the wall, the weight of regret pressing down on him until he could hardly breathe. He had lost what mattered most, not just the woman who loved him, but the two small lives born from that love. Late that night, he opened a drawer and took out an old photo, the one from their trip to Maine. Clara was smiling brightly, holding a handful of wildflowers, and he was standing behind her with his arms around her waist. Everything looked so simple and so far away. Ethan sat in silence for a long time before whispering into the darkness, "I'm sorry, Clara. I'm truly sorry." The next morning, Ethan arrived at the office late. He still couldn't shake the hollow feeling inside him. Everything that had once been his pride, the company, the reputation, the acclaimed designs, now seemed like nothing more than blocks of cold concrete. He called his private investigator, the same one who had assisted him in past security projects. He needed to know where Clara was living and what her life and the children's lives were like. 3 days later, the detective sent him a thin file. Ethan opened it, his heart heavy. Inside were a few color photographs showing Clara pushing a small pastry cart along Roosevelt Avenue in Queens. She wore a thick coat, her hair tied up, her face suntanned and weathered. Beside her were 2 little twin girls, one of them laughing brightly, holding on to her mother's skirt. Each picture felt like a blow to his chest. The report read, "Clara Reyes, 34 years old, resides in a small rented ground-floor apartment. Sells churros every morning from 5:30 a.m. to 11 a.m., sometimes until night if there are leftovers. In the evenings, she teaches drawing to neighborhood children for extra income. Twin daughters, approximately 5 years old. No debt record, no government assistance. Self-supporting." Ethan sat in silence for a long time. In his mind, he saw the Clara he used to know, the woman who loved to paint in the kitchen, sleeves stained with color, who would hug him from behind while he worked on his blueprints. And now she was still painting, still creating beauty, only this time in a harsher world, without him. He ran his finger lightly over one of the photos, Clara wiping sweat from her forehead, smiling at her daughters. That smile wasn't fragile, it was strength, pride, and faith in life itself. She had lost everything, yet she had never lost her dignity. Ethan felt his throat tighten. He had once imagined Clara as resentful, weak, perhaps even desperate enough to come back to him. But no, she had moved on. Alone? Strong enough not to need him anymore. That evening, Ethan returned to his apartment. The city outside still blazed with light, but inside him there was only darkness. He sat by the window, watching the cars stream past, and for the first time in years, he felt fear. Fear of the emptiness that success had brought, fear of the loneliness he had chosen for himself. He whispered, as if speaking to no one but the night, "She didn't fall apart, and yet here I am, with everything still breaking." And that night, he made a decision. Tomorrow, he would go to that street corner. The next morning, Ethan drove to Queens. The sky was overcast, gray clouds hanging low as if warning of an early rain. He pulled over by the curb, looking around. And then he saw her. Clara was standing at the very corner he had seen in the photos. Her muffin cart sent out a warm, sweet aroma that mingled with the cold air. The twin girls, dressed in pink and yellow sweaters, laughed beside her, occasionally helping their mother wrap the pastries. Ethan stood still for a moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, his heart pounding, each beat striking against the walls of his memory. Finally, he opened the car door and stepped out. Clara saw him instantly. Her eyes froze, then turned cold, like a sheet of ice over a lake. "What more do you want here, Ethan?" she asked, her voice calm but layered with pain. "I just want to talk," he said softly. "Just for a few minutes." "We already said everything, 6 years ago." "I know." Ethan paused, taking a deep breath. "But I didn't know about them." He looked toward the two girls. One of them was holding her sister's hand, her curious eyes fixed on the strange man standing nearby. "They're my daughters, aren't they, Clara?" Clara froze. Her lips trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady. "They're my daughters, Ethan. I raised them, taught them, loved them, while you chose to be absent." Ethan felt his chest tighten. "I didn't know, Clara. I thought—" "You thought what?" Clara cut him off, tears glistening at the corners of her eyes. "You thought I was just being stubborn, that I'd come back? Did you ever even try to call me?" Ethan said nothing. Every word of defense dissolved on his tongue. He remembered Fern, remembered the calls he had ignored, and realized he had lost far more than time could ever measure. "I was deceived," he whispered. "She lied, said you only wanted money, that you didn't want to see me." Clara let out a soft, bitter laugh. "Did it ever cross your mind to find out for yourself? Or was one lie enough to make you walk away from me?" The air between them grew thick. The noise of traffic and the wind seemed to fade into silence. The two little girls held hands and pressed closer to their mother. "I don't need your pity, Ethan," Clara said quietly, her eyes unwavering. "We're fine. I lost everything, but at least I kept my dignity." He nodded, his voice breaking. "I'm not here out of pity. I just wanted to know you're all right. And if I can, to make things right somehow." Clara looked at him for a long moment, then turned away. "There's nothing left to make right. Where were you when the girls were sick? When I couldn't afford warm clothes? When I cried because I was afraid I couldn't feed them?" She stopped, her voice cracking as tears welled up. "Where were you, Ethan?" "Clara, at least let me share some of the burden," Ethan said hoarsely, his voice trembling like a man clinging to the last thread of hope. "I don't need you to," she replied, her eyes never leaving the pan of sizzling oil. "Don't be so stubborn. Lila and Lucy are my daughters, too. I have a responsibility. I have a right—" "A right?" She turned around so suddenly that the metal tongs hit the counter with a sharp clang. "You lost that right the day you chose a contract over your family. A father who isn't there when he's needed doesn't have any right at all." Ethan drew in a deep breath as though even the air were cutting into his lungs. "I just want to make it right. Even if it's late, I still want to do what's right." Clara gave a faint smile, weary, not cruel. Some cracks, no matter how well you patch them, never return to what they were. I don't need anyone to fix things anymore, Ethan. I just need you to stop interfering in our lives. Please, stay away from us. After those words, there was only silence. Ethan stood there for an hour, just watching her work and watching the two little girls play. When Clara finally packed up her cart and started walking home, he remained where he was, hands clenched, eyes glistening. And in that moment, he understood. Sometimes the real pain doesn't come from rejection itself, but from realizing you've lost the chance to be forgiven. That evening, Ethan drove back to Manhattan. The city glowed with dazzling lights, yet to him they were nothing more than distant fragments, cold, empty, and meaningless. He turned off the engine and sat in the car for hours, hands resting limply on his lap, his mind hollow. Outside, the sound of wind mingled with the distant hum of car horns, a haunting reminder of the distance between two worlds, one built from the towers he designed and the other defined by the woman he had lost. He glanced into the rearview mirror. The face staring back at him was no longer that of a confident, proud man. It was weary, burdened, filled with regret. For the first time in years, Ethan felt small. He stepped into his apartment. Everything inside was immaculate, perfectly arranged, devoid of warmth. On the table, his awards, certificates, and architectural models gleamed under the cold white light of the ceiling lamp. He looked at them, and suddenly it all felt absurd. Those buildings might reach the sky, but not one of them could bring him back to the woman he loved. Ethan picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts. His finger stopped at a name. Mom. He hesitated for a few seconds before pressing call. Margaret's voice came through, gentle, yet carrying that familiar trace of firmness. Ethan, you're calling at this hour. Is something wrong? Mom, he faltered, his voice low. If someone's made too many mistakes, do they still have a chance to make things right? There was silence on the other end for a moment. Then she spoke slowly. My son, everyone deserves the chance to change, but no one can return to the past. You can only start again, if you truly want to. Ethan drew a deep breath. His voice trembled. I saw Clara again, and I have 2 daughters, Mom. 2 little girls who look so much like me that I can't look at them without feeling guilty. On the other end, Margaret sighed softly. My son, maybe it's time you learn how to be a father. You can lose your company, your reputation, but don't lose them again. Ethan closed his eyes, tears sliding quietly down his cheeks. From his mother's words, he understood. This was the end of the man he used to be, and the beginning of someone new. The next morning, Ethan walked into the largest toy store in the city. Hundreds of bright colors surrounded him, and for a moment he felt lost, as if he had stepped into a world he hadn't belonged to for the past 6 years. The shop assistant asked what he was looking for, and Ethan smiled faintly. Anything that can make 2 5-year-old girls smile. He chose 2 small pink bunny backpacks, a few floral dresses, some glitter-covered fairy tale books, and a box of crayons. Before leaving, he stopped by the ice cream counter and bought 3 vanilla cones, the kind he remembered Clara once loved. By noon, he was back on the corner of Queens. Sunlight spilled gold over the tin roofs where Clara stood sweating beside her sizzling pan of oil. The twins sat in the shade, sharing a bottle of water, their feet dusty, but their eyes bright. Ethan stopped a few steps away, afraid to disturb the fragile peace of their little world. Hello, he said softly, as if his voice alone might shatter the stillness. The girls looked up, eyes wide with surprise. You came back, mister, Lila cried. You said you would, and you really did. Lucy added, her innocent smile twisting something deep inside him. "And I kept my promise," Ethan said with a gentle smile, kneeling so his eyes met theirs. "Do you like princesses?" "Yes, and cotton candy too," both voices chimed at once. He chuckled and pulled out the small backpacks. "I brought a few little gifts, if your mom says it's okay." Clara turned around. Her gaze was still cold, but behind it lay a quiet exhaustion she couldn't hide. "There's no need for that, Ethan. They're for the girls, not for you." "I told you I don't want—" "Clara," he interrupted softly, his tone gentler now. "I'm not trying to make up for anything with gifts. I just want to see them happy. Just once." She froze for a moment, her eyes landing on her daughter's eager faces. Then she sighed. "Just for today." The twins rushed forward, their laughter ringing out above the hum of traffic. Lila hugged the pink bunny backpack, while Lucy giggled as she found the sparkling princess storybook inside. "Thank you, mister," they said in unison, their voices light and pure as the wind. Ethan sat there, watching their tiny heads glimmer in the sunlight, feeling warmth return to a heart he thought had gone cold forever. Clara watched him for a moment, her gaze softening though she didn't understand why. Perhaps it was memory. Or perhaps it was simply the moment when a tired heart stopped defending itself. "I'm not here to claim them," Ethan said quietly. "I just want to know what they like, what they need, and to be near them, even for a little while." She hesitated, then nodded slowly. "All right, but if you promise something, make sure you keep it." "This time," he said, "I will. I mean it." Before leaving, he placed 3 vanilla cones on the counter. "I remember you once said vanilla makes you feel calm." Clara looked surprised, then smiled faintly. "Thank you for remembering, but it's not necessary. Please don't turn me away again, Clara." She took one and bit into it softly. The vanilla melted on her tongue, and for an instant the afternoon breeze carried her back in time. She saw herself laughing in a garden, him wrapping his arms around her, their hands sticky with melting ice cream. "Thank you," Clara whispered, eyes lowered. Ethan replied gently, "I owe you a lifetime, Clara, not just an ice cream." He walked away slowly. Behind him, the twins ate their cones beside their mother, their laughter echoing down the street, a sound brighter and more healing than anything he had heard in years. On Monday morning, while he was in a meeting with the design team, his phone vibrated. An unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. A panicked woman's voice came from the other end of the line. "Are you a relative of Miss Clara Reyes? I'm Lucy's teacher. The little girl fell in the schoolyard and is now at Elmhurst Hospital." Ethan felt his heart drop. He didn't think, he just bolted out of the meeting room, leaving behind the startled looks of his colleagues. The street seemed endless, every red light cutting into his fear like a blade. When he arrived at the hospital, Clara was sitting in the hallway, her face pale, hands clenched tightly. He rushed toward her, breathless from running. "Where's Lucy?" She startled, turning around. Her eyes were both surprised and exhausted. "Ethan, how did you know?" "The teacher called me. I came to help." For a moment, Clara looked as if she might protest, but seeing the panic in his eyes, she simply nodded. "She's in the X-ray room. The doctor said it's just a minor fracture." Her voice trembled, but underneath it was a fierce effort to stay composed. They sat beside each other in silence. The hospital speaker crackled, and the sound of a gurney's wheels echoed down the tiled floor. Ethan looked at Clara's hands, clutching a crumpled tissue. He wanted to say something, but every word felt clumsy. Moments later, a nurse wheeled Lucy out. Her little arm was wrapped in a white cast, her eyes slightly red. When she saw her mother, Lucy smiled. "Mommy, I didn't cry." Clara gathered her into her arms, tears streaming down her face, while Ethan stood nearby, his heart melting. When they were doing the discharge paperwork, Clara reached for her wallet. Ethan placed his hand lightly over hers, stopping her. "Let me handle it. It's my fault for not being there when you needed me." Clara started to speak, but his eyes were so sincere that she fell silent. For the first time in years, what stood between them wasn't just the past, but something softer, real, quietly coming back to life. That evening, Ethan drove them home. In the small apartment, he helped warm the soup, set the table, and sat down to tell stories to the two girls. Lucy leaned against his shoulder, eyes half closed. Lila, sitting on the other side, quietly drew a picture of a small house with 4 people inside. Clara watched the scene, a strange feeling rising in her chest. Part warmth, part fear. She knew her heart was beginning to beat again, yet she was afraid to trust once more. Before leaving, Ethan said softly, "Thank you for letting me be here today." Clara replied gently, "Thank you for coming." And in the golden light spilling from the small window, Ethan smiled, for the first time in years. A real smile, not for success, but for something he had thought he'd lost forever. In the days that followed, Ethan began to appear more often on a quiet corner in Queens. No longer the man in an expensive suit, he now wore a simple sweater, a gray scarf, and carried a cup of hot coffee in his hands. He didn't come to talk, nor to persuade. He simply stood across the street, silently watching Clara and her daughters start their morning. Sometimes he would buy a box of churros, always paying more than the price, and only smile when Clara gave him a puzzled look. Gradually, his presence stopped bothering her. It became familiar, like a natural part of the morning scenery. One morning, when Clara was struggling with a stuck stroller wheel, Ethan stepped forward, knelt down, and quietly fixed it for her. He didn't say much, just smiled. "You learn fast," Clara said softly, her tone carrying a hint of teasing, but no bitterness. "My best teacher has always been my mistakes," he replied, making her laugh for the first time in years. From then on, Ethan became a small but constant part of their lives. He drove the girls to school every morning, sometimes picked them up when Clara was busy with customers. He didn't talk much, he just listened, and through each moment he slowly learned what he had never understood before. Being a father wasn't about knowing what to say, it was about knowing how to be there. One afternoon, while he was waiting at the school gate, the twins came running toward him. "Uncle Ethan, I got an A today," Lila shouted, waving her paper proudly. He crouched down, patting her head. "That's wonderful, my little princess." Lucy looked up at him innocently. "Uncle, why are you always here?" Ethan smiled. "Because I like seeing you smile." The two girls giggled and held his hands tightly. That evening, Clara made tea while watching him read bedtime stories to the girls. The warm light fell across his face, and her heart trembled unexpectedly. When he closed the book, both girls were already asleep, Lucy resting her head on his leg. "You did well," Clara whispered, afraid to break the fragile peace of the moment. "I'm just relearning something I should have known long ago." "Being a father?" "No," Ethan said softly, his voice low and sincere. "Being human." Another afternoon, his mother, Margaret, came to visit. Clara grew nervous, and the girls curiously ran out to greet her. Margaret looked at the two children, her eyes welling with tears. "They're beautiful," she said in a trembling voice. Clara remained silent, while Ethan stood beside her, gently placing a hand on his mother's shoulder. That day, the 5 of them sat around the small table for lunch. It wasn't luxurious, just the smell of baked pastries, the laughter of children, and the quiet honesty in their gazes. Margaret took Clara's hand and said softly, "Thank you for being strong. Thank you for not letting them grow up without love." Clara nodded, tears silently falling. In the days that followed, the air around them began to change, slowly warming, like a small room just opened to sunlight. Clara began to fear that warmth. Because sometimes, when happiness comes too gently, one doesn't know whether to believe in it or to guard against it. Each morning, when the familiar knock sounded, she knew it was him. Ethan stood there, no longer in a suit, no longer the image of a successful businessman, just a man holding a cup of coffee for her and 2 muffins for Lila and Lucy. He spoke little, smiled often, and each time he looked at the girls, his eyes softened, so tenderly it made her heart tremble, a tenderness she once thought he had forgotten how to give. One afternoon, while Clara was washing the frying pan, the sound of running water and the golden light of sunset blended into a fragile peace. "Mommy," Lila said softly, "is Mr. Ethan our daddy?" The spoon slipped from Clara's hand and fell into the sink with a sharp clang. Lucy looked up, her eyes wide. "We're serious," she said. "He looks just like us, and he looks at you like in the fairy tales." Clara gave a faint, trembling smile, part sorrow, part fear. "No, sweetheart, he's just a good friend of Mommy's." But even in her own voice, she could hear something cracking, like ice on a spring lake beginning to melt. That night, she told Ethan what had happened. He was silent for a long time before saying, "Maybe it's time they know the truth." "I'm afraid," she admitted. "If you leave again, they won't survive it." Ethan took her hand gently, his eyes steady. "I left once, and I've paid for it all my life. I won't make that mistake again. Not ever." The next morning, he arrived earlier than usual. The small room glowed softly. The girls sat on the floor, coloring intently. Clara looked at him, anxious yet trusting, and gave a small nod. Ethan knelt beside the children. His voice was low, steady, warm like the first breath of morning. "Lila, Lucy, there's something I need to tell you." The girls looked up, waiting, their crayons frozen mid-air. "I'm not just Mommy's friend," he said. "I'm your dad." The room fell silent. Only the soft whir of the ceiling fan could be heard. Lucy blinked. "Really, mister?" Ethan nodded, his eyes red. "Really, and I'm sorry for not being here sooner, for letting you grow up without me." Lila set her crayon down and asked softly, "Are you going to leave again?" Ethan smiled, a trembling but truest smile. "Never again. I'll be here, not just today, but every day. I promise you'll never have to wait for me anymore." The 2 girls threw themselves into his arms. Their laughter mixed with tears, tiny hands clutching his shirt as if afraid he might vanish. Clara stood nearby, hands still damp with soap, watching the 3 of them embrace in a patch of sunlight by the window. Tears rolled down her cheeks, warm and light, like a summer rain. For the first time in 6 years, she was no longer afraid, because in that small room, once filled with loss, there was now laughter, warmth, and one simple promise: family. A few weeks later, their lives turned a new page. Ethan sold his luxurious apartment in the heart of Manhattan, once a symbol of success, now nothing more than a hollow shell of lonely years. He took Clara and their 2 daughters away from the old neighborhood to a quiet suburb in northern New York. The small house stood on a street lined with maple trees. Every morning, sunlight streamed through the windows, casting soft gold over the white curtains, while Lila and Lucy ran around the garden, laughing amid the sound of birds. Clara replanted a few flower beds by the porch, lavender, daisies, and even basil, because she said she wanted the kitchen to always smell fresh and alive. Ethan no longer went to the office. He managed his work remotely, just a laptop and a few video meetings. Now he woke early to bake bread with his wife, walked the girls to school, and in the afternoons took them to the nearby park to practice riding their bikes on a small hill. Each time they fell, he rushed over, smiling as he brushed the dust from their knees and said, "Come on, my brave little girls." In the evenings, the family dined under the soft glow of golden light. Clara often sat beside him, her hands intertwined with his, as if afraid he might disappear again. But Ethan simply gave a gentle squeeze, his silent way of promising that he was truly home and would never leave again. Some nights, after the girls had fallen asleep, he would quietly open their bedroom door, watch them curled up beneath their blankets, and listen to the soft, steady rhythm of childhood breathing. And in that peaceful stillness, Ethan felt himself forgiven, not by words, but by the quiet light of serenity that filled this home. 6 lost years, a lifetime of atonement, and at last he had found what he once thought was gone forever. Now, in a modest suburb of New York, there stood a small house where the scent of cinnamon and vanilla drifted in the air, where children's laughter echoed across the white fence, and where a man who had once lost everything finally learned that happiness is not found in power or wealth, but in the simple mornings spent beside the ones he loves.